Hey guys, so this is our unit PowerPoint lecture for Unit 7A, which covers the topics of imperialism, progressivism, and World War I. So let's get started. All right, so we started off this unit by referencing the Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis idea that we first introduced back in period 5, and then brought back up again in period 6 for Manifest Destiny, and then continued westward expansion. And now it relates to the idea of imperialism, because as imperialism is by definition the process of taking over other parts of the world in some way, exerting some kind of influence or control. Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis is one of the justifications for expanding outside of our borders, because as he says, it's synonymous with the American culture to always have a place to overcome. Those challenges make us what we are. That's part of the American identity. And now that we have pretty much settled, our full continental area, what is going to be our next frontier, or else we'll become stagnant. And that is encouraging the US to change their foreign policy. We are still being isolationist, meaning that we are staying on our side of the world. We're not getting involved or intervening in anyone else's affairs. Nor are we creating alliances, really, no formal alliances, but we do want to build an empire by more territorial acquisitions or exerting some kind of influence over other areas. And so up until this point, our foreign policy has been the Monroe Doctrine ever since period 4. So the last 100 years or so, we have been operating under this foreign policy where basically told Europe, after the War of 1812, we felt super, proud of ourselves, even though we didn't necessarily win, but we didn't lose. We popped up our chest and said, all right, Europe, you stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on our side of the world. We won't tolerate any kind of further colonization or interference from you into the Western Hemisphere, which pretty much made the US the de facto leader in the Western Hemisphere. We basically said that we are kind of like the policemen out here, and we just kind of oversee Central and South America. So far, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and other nations, but those are the main ones, have slowly been building their empires. Some has started way earlier, Britain being one of them. That's why England is also known as Great Britain, because that references the greater empire. But Great Britain is probably the best example for this. And so while these nations have continued to imperialize places like Africa, Asia, and Pacific Ocean, what I discussed in class is that there's a very clear commonality in our modern time between the imperial nations versus the colonized nations, and that what we consider first-tier nations are the ones that way back when were able to start imperialism very early on, that they were able to industrialize and had a strong enough economy and political structure to allow that kind of growth. And just because of that, they got ahead. And once the colonization of these weaker nations began, they'll never be able to get caught up, because they were robbed of their workforces, their natural resources, their countries were disrupted from their natural growth patterns. And that's why today we can link the history of what kind of creates a first world nation versus a third world nation all the way back to this international Darwinism, which is essentially social Darwinism from the last unit, just on an international scale. Now, we went to the 4 supporters of imperialism, the first being missionaries. So these are the people, Christians, but specifically Protestants, who believe that we have a religious duty to colonize other lands. And so that would encourage us to convert others. Josiah Strong wrote his book, Our Country, where he argues that, if you look at all the Christian nations, they are all the most civilized, industrial nations, the most economically strong. And so what must bind them all together is their Christian faith. And so that is what that's what makes them a superior civilization. So if you bring them religion, you'll bring them all these other positive attributes. And so that's his justification for going out and converting other parts of the world. And the second group would be politicians, specifically Republicans. Politicians in general will use imperialism as a way to progress their career, because it's impressive to build an empire. But Republicans specifically like more connections with other places in the world. It's great for business because it's great for trade. You can get new materials. You can get new markets for selling your goods. So they're going to endorse the use of even military, which brings us to the next group. but they'll be the ones that endorse the military, which kind of starts Republicans' longstanding relationship with the military, kind of stems back to these early days of imperialism. And not only Republicans will support the military, but you also have folks like Alfred Mehan, where he argues that a strong Navy is crucial to the country's growth because you need a Navy to help facilitate trade. They are the ones who go out and win new markets. They're the ones who create a lot of those connections. And so if you build up your military, it also helps you take over other parts of the world, either by force, whatever it is. So military and imperialism are intertwined, according to him. And so if you build up one, you'll get the other. And this allows or encourages Congress to throw buckets and buckets of money to building up the Navy. And by 1900, the US had the third largest Navy. Again, on the heels of our second industrial revolution, a lot of that money went to the latest and greatest technology. And we have a very impressive Navy, which again, we have to give credit where credit's due. The US's growth over the last period or so has been astonishing. But the fourth and final group is press. So specifically newspapers are going to find their stride during this time. It was brought up in period 6 during the Gilded Age that, with new inventions like better printing presses, we have more newspapers. And so print culture is exploding during this time. And also with the growth of business, people want to make money by selling stories. And so they find that, if they report on foreign nations, these exotic places, people will eat that up, and there's a market and a demand for people to want to hear about these stories. And so we talked about the US's baby steps towards imperialism. So we can see kind of different strategies that they use. The first one just being a straight up purchase, how he purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. And even though people call it Seward's folly, meaning that the Secretary of State, John Seward, basically saying that like this was a mess up, like Alaska was pointless. I mean, he'll be laughing in the end when we talk about that in later units, but regardless, it shows our early attempts are non-military based. It's about buying, and he does justify it by saying this upholds the Monroe Doctrine because now we removed Russia one more time from the Western Hemisphere. So it upholds that mentality that we want them to leave their colonies and let the US just kind of maintain dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Another example is the Pan American Conference. Pan means all, so this is essentially the All American Conference. So you have like North America, Middle America, or Central America and South America. And this encourages representatives from all these nations in the Western Hemisphere to have this international cooperation, meaning basically that collective security that we talked about in the beginning, where everyone can work together to solve issues. But the US is essentially the de facto leader of this and will be as these conferences continue for several periods, all the way into the modern decade. And the US is hoping that by doing this, not only do they maintain that these areas will be loyal to the US, but then that increases trade, which is good for our economy, but also keeps them strong from European influences because they're more loyal to the US and hopefully economically stronger by being paired with the US. But then we start to see an escalation in US foreign policy with issues like Hawaii, the annexation of Hawaii. So even though Hawaii is very far off the coast of the US, we have had a longstanding relationship with Hawaii for a while. We've been sending missionaries there for a while. We've had businesses set up there for sugar plantations. And also just with their proximity to Asia, we've used them as like partly for their trade route. Until we realize that we want more. Like we realize how strategic their location is geographically and the money that can be made from the sugar. And so initially there was a diplomatic reach out to annex Hawaii, but obviously they're going to refuse. They want to maintain independence until Americans launch a hostile takeover and overthrow the last Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. And it's gonna sit on the back burner for a while. It won't be until a little bit later when we discuss the Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines, will then people be open to annexing Hawaii. But right now it's gonna sit pretty as a territory or a colony, kind of in a limbo. So then I have you guys look at some pro and anti-imperialist arguments. And we'll revisit those when we talk about the Spanish or the Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines, so we'll put a pin in that for right now. But to give you some context about what's been going on leading up to the Spanish-American War, Cuba has always been in the control of Spain. It has been ever since it's been known, that area known as been like Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic, for like since it was founded by Columbus. So like this whole area has had a very big Spanish presence. And so they've never gained their independence, and they've tried several times. The US is really aware of this. We've been notified that they've been put, like the natives have been put in deadly camps because of their uprisings. American newspapers publish this kind of stuff. And again, it creates more public outcry about how maybe the US should get involved. But all the presidents so far have been adamantly disengaged with that conflict. And it's not even just a certain party. Democrat President Cleveland and Republican President McKinley both thought military action was morally wrong, economically unsafe for the United States, and just not our place. So what changed? Well, there are four causes for the Spanish-American War. The first one being jingoism. Jingoism is an intense form of nationalism, and it's just this intense pride for your country to the point where you feel like you need to prove it with your aggressive foreign policy. It's like the guy who just wants to prove how tough he is by punching someone in the face. Like that's jingoism. And then the second cause is yellow journalism or press. You might see it referred to as either one, but in your book, it's yellow journalism, which, as we mentioned earlier, newspapers are taking off at their height of popularity right now. They have a mass audience, a mass reach, and they want to sell newspapers by printing sensationalistic reporting with bold headlines of things that are like tragic and emotion filled. It's kind of like modern day tabloids. They don't have to be factual. They just have to sell. And Pulitzer and Hearst, hence like Pulitzer Prize, like these are like the competing heads of the two competing newspapers, really based in New York. And they're going to print these exaggerated and false accounts of what the Spanish are doing in Cuba, the death camps, and just kind of like really building that up and hopefully sparking humanitarian efforts and just anti-Spanish sentiment. And then we have the Delhomme letter, which we took actually off of your vocab list, but I still think it kind of just adds to the plight of the Americans versus the Spanish, where Spanish diplomat Delhomme was caught criticizing President McKinley in this leaked letter to the American press. And I mean, again, insulting our president, that's like an insult to American honor, especially at this time prior to when that's commonplace to criticize politicians, especially the president. And so people had even more animosity towards the Spanish government. And like literally less than a week later, the sinking of the USS Maine in the Cuban harbor. So outside of the place we've been talking about, Cuba, we had a neutral trade vessel, USS Maine, that exploded right outside of Cuba. And the American newspapers blasted all over, the front page the next day that Spain had attacked the U.S. It is later, at the time, it was truly unknown what caused it. Later, it is suggested that it was just a faulty ship, but it doesn't matter. As soon as it hit the newspapers, in the public or a court of public opinion, Spain just attacked the United States, and there was a public outcry to declare war to defend American honor. But still, President William McKinley is still hesitant. He initially issues an ultimatum to demand that Spain ends the ceasefire, but when Spain says that they didn't do anything, because in reality they didn't, he kind of quickly changes his tune, especially when he hears it seems that the majority of the public support this war. He seems to change his tune really fast. Politicians tend to do that. And so McKinley finally went to Congress and gave the reasons to declare war on Spain. And what I pointed out in class, which I thought is really interesting, is that these are his three reasons. The second and third, I think, are the ones that we've seen previously in American history. Like, we need to protect our trade, our businesses. There's Americans living in Cuba, like all about American interests. But that first one is actually, I would say, the almost primary focus at the beginning of his speech when he goes in front of Congress and asks to declare war to end the bloodshed and violence in Cuba. And this is the first time we're seeing America advocate intervening, like breaking its isolationist policy, intervening on behalf of someone else in the name of freedom, in the name of protecting other nations. And there's a clear break in foreign policy from our past. And this is going to set a precedent. And the U.S. is slowly going to assume the role over time of the world's policeman. That is a phrase that we're going to start revisiting in future units, but we can start to see that development here. And the Teller Amendment in 1898 is simultaneously the declaration for war that Congress passes, saying that we are going to declare war on Spain. But simultaneously, we also say that we are while we are going to plan to liberate Cuba, we have no intentions of taking control of Cuba, that they will be independent. So you can see this political cartoon where the US is literally shielding Cuba with the American flag, again, painting the US as in this new light of the protector, as opposed to, just only acting in self-interest. So again, breaking the past from foreign policy. We don't focus too much on the fighting of the war. I did want you guys to know about Theodore Roosevelt as the Secretary of the Navy, because this is where he rises to prominence and notoriety for his actions as Secretary of the Navy and just organizing all of that. He leads the Rough Riders as well, which is this regiment of volunteer fighters on horseback with swords. But the strategy, I also think, is kind of noteworthy, that how we decide that we're going to attack Spain is not just like going to Spain and physically attacking them there. We decide that the best way to hit them where it hurts is to actually go around and to liberate their colonies. And so we actually head to the Philippines, one of their most prided colonies. So we ally with the rebels there, people who have been advocating for freedom forever. We ally with the Filipino rebels and we are able to liberate the Philippines. And then we go to Cuba and do the exact same thing. We ally with the rebels there and help them secure their freedom until Spain ultimately surrenders due to the fact that they are losing multiple colonies. And again, colonies like mercantilism, losing your empire, like that is what defines a first tier nation in this time. And so they must surrender. And so just so we can see visually where all these areas are, we're talking about Cuba right here. We have Puerto Rico over here, still kind of in our backyard, but the Philippines and Guam are way over here, double the distance than Hawaii. So what does this mean for the United States? So the Treaty of Paris of 1898, this war was so short. I mean, it happened in around a year's time. And that's why President McKinley and his party kind of start to call, quote, a splendid little war, just because they're like, oh, it's so cute. It was such a cute little war. I mean, it was kind of a piece of cake, just to kind of, again, amplify the United States' position in the world as being kind of like the new big bad country. But regardless, in this treaty, we do uphold the Teller Amendment. Cuba is independent as promised. We also get Puerto Rico and Guam from Spain. The US will buy the Philippines for $20 million. That also just helps us, because it's the most prominent and important one to them. It helps us to secure it just a little bit more, like secure our claim over it. But that's the problem is with the Philippines. The biggest controversy is in the treaty, it does propose the annexation of the Philippines. So in order for Congress to approve all of this, the annexation of the Philippines is also on the table, so it must be decided. And that treaty was ultimately ratified in 1899 after a long, lengthy debate with just one vote above the 2/3 required by the Constitution in order to do so. So why was the debate so controversial? So you guys also looked at Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burdens poem. This is also the man that wrote the Jungle Book, with very similar imperialism, like the original story, imperialism kind of racist sentiments kind of riddled throughout. I encourage you guys to kind of explore that background of him and his ideologies, but you can already start to see it in the White Man's Burden poem where he argues that in this debate about annexation and imperialism, he argues that the other nations of the world are uncivilized and underdeveloped, and therefore they're not ready for independence. And it is our burden as a white civilized nation with cultural superiority to civilize them, that they cannot be independent. We need to maintain control over them in order to convert them, have them convert to democracy, capitalism, the American way, which we equate with civilization and success. But other arguments for the pro side, we say that rivals would take it if we don't. It allows the missionaries to continue to spread Christianity. The proximity will help us get closer to China and just Asia overall for trade. And it's a prize for winning the war, so why not? But on the no side, it is too far away to control. Like, as you could see from the map, like that is very costly in terms of just maintaining authority over a place that's literally on the other side of the world, like as far from us as it could possibly be. So that's a lot of responsibility. The people there don't want to be controlled. So you might think of that also from a moral reason, but also logistically, if you have to squash rebellions all the time, it makes it difficult. It's a huge population that are not the same as us. So again, you can look at that from a moral reason that we don't know what's best for them, or you can think of it from like Andrew Carnegie's quote that you looked at in class, where he argues that he doesn't want racial mixing from these places because it could encourage immigration if we did annex them. But the last two are the biggest anti-imperialism reasons. It violates the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It goes against everything that we stood for as a country ever since the start of our country about freedom and sovereignty and self-determination. And also, we've always preached isolationism. Ever since we were created, we preached isolationism and to focus on ourselves. And that proximity to Asia could drag us into Asian and European conflicts, just because what if the Philippines get caught in the crossfire? Our commercial interests could be threatened. It's a very natural thing that could occur. But then also, the people there don't want to be annexed. The Filipinos were outraged of their denial of independence because they thought they were going to get the same treatment as Cuba. We kind of led them to believe that when we fought alongside them and liberated them. Emilio Aguinaldo led a band of guerrilla fighters against the U.S. imperialists, and ultimately were squashed. But it's just a heartbreaking piece of evidence to show how the natives of these countries do not want us there. And because of all these anti-imperialist arguments, William Jennings Bryan, the Populist Party president, and like the failed candidate for president, he starts the Anti-Imperialist League that tries to prevent further acquisition of territory around the world. And then we passed the Platt Amendment, which it doesn't violate the Teller Amendment on paper because Cuba is still sovereign, they're still independent, but the Platt Amendment significantly lessens the independence that Cuba is going to feel. So let's take a look at this. First, it limits their ability to sign treaties with other nations, like the U.S. has to approve it first. The U.S. can intervene to maintain independence and order whenever they see fit. And the U.S. will help maintain a permanent naval base in Cuba, which is how we get Guantanamo Bay. So when you put all this together, the U.S. is like it's a very domineering presence that we're going to have over Cuba. And so this political cartoon that was on the Teller Amendment slide now has kind of a little bit more of a sinister vibe to it, now being paired with the Platt Amendment. And now it feels a little bit more like captive, almost, as opposed to protection. And so if you remember, I said the distinction I can always think of to differentiate between the Teller and the Platt Amendment. For the Teller Amendment, it's what we told Cuba our intentions were to be, for them to be independent. But Platt, I think, splat, which is kind of like the depressing end to like in reality, their independence. And then in order to kind of set the precedent for what all of these territories or annexed areas are going to look like, the insular or island cases are the series of Supreme Court cases that answer the question of, does the Constitution violate the flag? And they ruled that no, constitutional rights are not automatically extended to the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, which is actually still a major issue today for Puerto Rico. That's something we'll talk about in period 9. And I brought up the election of 1900 because I think it's a good indication of where the public is at this time. It's basically just a repeat of the election of 1896. And if you remember, that's the last election. That was the last bit of information from period 6. And it was the same two candidates, Republican William McKinley and Democrat, well, now he's running as a Democrat, but he was Democrat/populist William Jennings Bryan. And McKinley was about pro-business, gold standard, pro-imperialism, not about government regulation, blah, blah, blah. He's getting a little scared because he might lose if he doesn't start acting like he's doing something to regulate, the economy. And William Jennings Bryan about free coinage of silver, helping the working class and the farmers mainly, and anti-imperialism. Well, I just kind of like gave everything away. Like, that is the new issue on the table, is imperialism. So it's basically like a 2.0 of that election 4 years later, but now the new item on the agenda, like the main thing, the main part of the platform everyone's paying attention to, is if the candidate is pro-imperialism or not. And the fact that Republican McKinley, the president during the Spanish-American War, is now all of a sudden pro-imperialism because he has that under his belt, because now all of a sudden he's changing his tune and is really advocating for imperialism, which previously he was not. He was hesitant to annex Hawaii, to get involved in the Spanish-American War. But the fact that the U.S. votes for McKinley gives us a little bit of indication that the American public seems to lean on the side of the gold standard, business, and imperialism. And then what's happening in China? So I asked you guys in class, if you guys ever wondered why China just seems to be like the industrial manufacturing powerhouse of the world today, it all stems back to this. China had a very different relationship with imperialism than any other nation, any other third world nation. So China initially was an underdeveloped nation, but it's very large. It has a lot of natural resources, and also its proximity to European and Asian nations makes it easier to kind of maintain control. And so by the 1890s, Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany had all established what we're going to call a sphere of influence in China. So you can see the different colors. That's basically like regions within China where they've kind of carved out their own dominance. They have a huge presence there, whether it's a military presence, usually it's an economic based one. And so they don't own the territory, but they have such a presence there that they essentially do. And the US wants to get in on that. And Secretary of State John Hay proposed the open door policy, where he sent out these letters to all these other nations and then was like, hey, how about we all have trading rights in China? How about we just all, would it be fun if we all had a sphere of influence and all respected each other's? And sadly, and kind of pathetically, no one really responded, but no one really stopped the US when we went over to begin our imperialization of China. And that could have been, again, partly because the US is starting to become a threat to the other nations. So that could have something to do with it. But once again, the people there do not want us there. The Boxer Rebellion, also known as the Society of Harmonious Fists, which are these Chinese nationalists that start going around and attacking the foreign settlements and the missionaries that are there to convert them, and all the other nations that are currently there with the US band together to crush it. But it's just a further piece of evidence that the people who are being taken over don't want to be taken over. You guys have looked at a bunch of political cartoons. Political cartoons are huge during this time. And so they are very popular primary sources to use for period 7. And then we had a look at the 3 imperial presidents. So now that the US is kind of fully embraced imperialism, the next 3 presidents are all going to fully embrace it. That's why they're called the 3 imperial presidents. And they all have very different foreign policy styles. You have Theodore Roosevelt, when he was asked about his foreign policy style, he said you should always speak softly and carry a big stick, which is why we get big stick diplomacy, meaning that you should, start with diplomacy, start with civility, but use aggression or military power if need be. And it makes sense. He was the Secretary of the Navy. He believes in the power of the military. So it makes sense given his point of view. Then you have William Howard Taft, who believes in dollar diplomacy, using a country's financial power to extend influence. Maybe that is increasing or withholding trade, tariffs, things like that. And then Woodrow Wilson is about a moral diplomacy or a moral approach, all about respecting the rights of other nations and upholding freedom and democracy, self-determination. And so I had you guys look at the instances where these presidents employed their foreign policy and kind of judged it. And so we took a look at Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, his big example would be the Panama Canal. And I mean, economically, this is great for the United States because if you look at it, so if you look at the Isthmus of Panama, it's the smallest point in Central South America to where we could just bypass the long route all around South America just to get over here into the Atlantic Ocean. That cuts the trade route less or like more than half. That is incredible. And we can also charge other nations for bypassing South America and using our canal as well. So economically, it is great for the United States. However, the means that we go about securing it are very controversial. We take a old page out of our book and we go to Panama and we ask the Panamanians if they want independence, because we know they do. They've been rebelling against Colombia forever, like in similar situation that we did with the Philippines, with Cuba. And so once they're independent, we kind of strong on them in their kind of more vulnerable state without a really representative government just yet. Like without a stable government, to sign this treaty that allows us access to build the Panama and grants us ownership of that piece of land. And Americans are divided at home because we destroyed the environment of Panama. Even to this day, they have significant environmental concerns because of the construction that surrounded the canal. And then Roosevelt follows up with his addition to the American foreign policy. So this is the Roosevelt Corollary, which is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, where he says the U.S. will intervene in Latin America whenever necessary. Basically, again, strongly reaffirming that we are the big brother of the region. We are going to oversee them. You can see the big stick diplomacy in there. It sounds a little threatening. And he has used it to justify sending military into Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Haiti. It's going to lead to various ill relationships with Latin America, but that's something that we're going to revisit in subsequent units, particularly in the Cold War. Other examples that you guys could have used to look at his big stick diplomacy, I think the Gentleman's Agreement and the Great White Fleet pair nicely to show the speak softly but also carry a big stick part. So in the U.S., California had some current discriminatory laws against Japanese Americans, and Japan was angry about it. And so the U.S. Roosevelt proposed what's called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was like this informal agreement between both leaders, where the Japanese government would kind of restrict immigration to the United States, and California will repeal the racist laws. And so that's kind of the speak softly part. But then he follows it up with the Great White Fleet, which is with our newly industrialized fleet that we've invested so much money into because of people like Alfred Mahan. And Roosevelt, as the Secretary of Navy, once he became president, strongly advocated for pouring more and more money into the Navy. Again, it makes sense with his background and kind of his foreign policy point of view. Sailed the Great White Fleet around. They didn't do anything except docking at various ports around the world, kind of as a show of force, a big flex by the United States government. And then Taft. We don't really have a whole lot for him. He was only in power for one term. And so with 4 years, while he did employ like investing more in other countries, like for instance, in our sphere of influence, we pour a lot of money into that area in China to like create a lot of railroads and create more stable businesses there. I mean, yes, that could help our economy, but it's hard to gauge it in the long run. But we will see this same ideology pop back up in later units. We can kind of judge its effectiveness then. And then we have Woodrow Wilson. He's got 2 terms in office, and he, is the moral diplomacy guy. This is evident when he made William Jennings Bryan the leader of the Anti-Imperialist League, the Secretary of State, the position and power in the United States that dictates foreign policy. So the guy that's supposed to dictate foreign policy is not about taking over other nations. So it was a very strategic move on his part. Just so a couple of examples you guys could have pointed to for the moral diplomacy is that he granted U.S. citizenship to all the inhabitants of Puerto Rico, which they still have to this day, but with limited rights. The Jones Act grants full territorial status to the Philippines. They get the Bill of Rights, they get suffrage, and they will become independent as soon as they're stable, which that does happen later on. Okay, so now we're going to enter progressivism, which is happening simultaneously with imperialism. So these time periods are right on top of each other. And so progressivism is just the new wave of reforms. We had the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian revolutions of 1800 and 1830, which were more about just giving more power to the people politically, like expanding suffrage. But the antebellum reforms right before the Civil War in the mid 1800s is a little bit closer to what the progressive movement is, because it's a diverse group of reforms, and it wasn't top down. It wasn't the president dictating it. These are grassroots movements where the people are trying to get legislation passed and help each other. And that's kind of what the progressive movement continues. We saw this with the populist movement as well, even though that was not as successful in its time during the Gilded Age. The progressive movement is like the spiritual successor of the populist. We take a lot of the Omaha platform and start to enact it and get things done during this, so that they're inspired by the populist. And so all the issues of the Gilded Age, basically they want to address, and it's mainly white urban middle class people that'll be forwarding a lot of these movements. So one of the groups I want you guys to focus on was like all of well, essentially the use of media. Muckrakers is a term about investigative writers who expose the problems of society in hoping to inform and reform. So you have, again, with the expansion of these newspapers, you have this mass audience that is with this hunger for kind of scandalous works. And so uncovering, corruption and the slums. I mean, it feeds into all that wanting. And so you have Lincoln Steffens, who writes The Shame of Cities, which it talks about political corruption in the cities and exposes things like Tammany Hall and other political machines. Jacob Riis's famous book, How the Other Half Lives, is a photojournalism where these are his pictures where he went around and had these pictures of just the horrible living conditions in tenements and in the slums. And it really raised a lot of people's sympathy, for the people who are living in poverty. You have Ida Tarbell's The History of the Standard Oil Company, where she goes after the Standard Oil, one of the largest monopolies in the country, but to the middle class, it highlights the dangers of the monopolies in the country. And then you also have political cartoonists such as Thomas Nast. A lot of the cartoons you guys looked at earlier in this unit and would probably see on a test, a lot of them are Thomas Nast. Then there's a bunch of political reforms. And so these are the ones I just picked from your book. The secret ballot, also known as the Australian ballot, means that who you vote for is now secret, which sounds like a no-brainer. But before this, it was not. And it was actually an intimidation tactic used by business owners because, as in the last unit, we said that business owners and workers had a tumultuous relationship, and business owners and politicians had a corrupt relationship where they would fund their campaigns, but then, in like as a tit for tat relationship, they would pass or block legislation that would help that business or hurt that business. And so business leaders could, force their workers to vote for a politician, and they could get fired if they didn't. And this allows, for a little bit more, obviously privacy, but it puts a little bit more power back in the common people and away from the business owners who can't get fired based on who you vote for. Direct primaries put more power directly in the citizens' hands by allowing citizens to vote for a party's candidate for president instead of political machines. So like the last time we revisited this was back in period 4 when we talked about how King Caucus was replaced by party nominating conventions, which was a step in the right direction. However, that just slowly got dominated by political machines. So it was still the heads of the party, like really prominent folks still deciding in party nominating conventions. And it wasn't as public as it could have been. And so this put it in the hands of the people. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of US senators, like on a federal level. We've already had them on a state level since Andrew Jackson's time. That was one of the political reforms then. But since then, state legislators choose the federal legislators, and now we get to elect both. And then recall, referendum, and initiative are also kind of all simultaneously, they're paired together in your book a lot. So recall is when voters can remove an office or an official from office prior to the end of their term. Maybe it's corruption, maybe they're just not doing their job, whatever it is. It's kind of hard to do, but you can do it. So it's supposed to keep them more accountable. When you think of it, like if there's a faulty product, you can recall it. And then, it all has to go back to the person who created the product. So that's the same premise. A referendum is when the public can vote on a proposed bill or law in the ballot box. Because of the size of our nation, we've never really had national referendums, or usually like maybe at a state level at most, but maybe like usually local or municipal city level. And then an initiative is when voters can propose a new bill or law. And so some other things were happening during this time is that like we're trying to clean up the cities. I mean, you have like temperance and prohibition starting to be advocated for, but they're not getting anything done just yet. But the big thing here is that Robert Lafayette's Wisconsin idea argues that we should have permanent regulatory bodies to monitor things like railroads, utilities, and businesses, primarily utilities. Like we're trying to get a lot of the the things that feel public in nature regulated. And then in terms of like workplaces and consumer protections, it initially starts with children and women for workers' protections, and then eventually it will get expanded upon to general workers. But you have people with the National Child Labor Committee, prohibiting child labor and passing compulsory attendance laws. That's where you get like truancy in today's time. But then you have an incident like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and that factory in New York went ablaze. It's in a very public place. People saw over 100 women just dying in this cramped, overcrowded, nasty workplace where women were, because there's no regulations in like how the building's constructed. There's no fire escape. There's no multiple exits. There's nothing there to protect the workers. And you had even women jumping from the gain national attention in the newspapers. Again, we have these photos being printed in the newspaper. Of course, it's going to raise public opinion on the issue. And so we start to see a little bit more protection initially for women workers and children, but eventually will help all workers. And then NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and League of Women Voters, both part of Carrie Chapman Catt's vision for getting women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment we'll revisit a little bit later because that doesn't get secured until after World War I. And it's a combined effort of these groups and women's role in the economy, protests, and also their role during World War I. And then you also have women like Alice Paul, who I wanted to mention, just so you can see the dichotomy and the difference in how people go about the same reforms. Like Carrie Chapman Catt is organizing like political groups, and you have Alice Paul who is doing like mass protests and demonstrations to get a little bit more like of an emotional approach. And then in terms of African Americans, we have the NAACP being created, the National Association for the Advancements of Colored People, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, and the National Urban League as well, which isn't still around today, or like it's kind of morphed into a larger group that we'll revisit in period 9, but the NAACP is still around. But the National Urban League helped African Americans create this mass movement, this mass migration called the Great Migration into northern cities. And that's why the modern demographic, if you look at the United States, like a demographic map, our population, at least the African American population, is largely centered in the north and in cities. It was back during this time to help them get out of the segregated South, where the Jim Crow laws are still reigning supreme, and the KKK is running rampant, and those southern state governments, I mean, this is not long after the Civil War, they're still facing a lot of racism, and there's job opportunities now in the cities. Okay, and then we'll look at the 3 progressive presidents. And so I started off by saying that Teddy Roosevelt firmly believed that it was the president's prerogative to dictate what progressive reforms Congress should be legislating and focusing on, which is known as the bully pulpit ideology. So one of the first things he does is the ideology of the square deal, where he favored neither labor nor management. And one great example of that is the anthracite coal miner strike, where he forced both sides, the workers and management, to have an arbitration at the White House, or he would send in troops to like close the company. So like, I mean, that's a very big show of force. And especially when previous presidents all took the side of management, clearly, as we saw like with Cleveland stuff, it's a very big break from the past. So he's trying to set a new precedent. And he's the first president to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. And even with that poorly worded, ineffective law, he busted more than 40 trusts. He went after even the Standard Oil monopoly and the Northern Securities Company, which was actually one of Vanderbilt's most prominent railroad monopolies. So, I mean, these are big fish. But the difference here that he has between like Taft, in a minute, we'll say, Roosevelt made a distinction between good and bad trust. A good trust or a good monopoly is one that, with their dominance, can keep prices low. They can create a thought of efficiency. It's kind of like a difficult argument, for some people to swallow, but the bad trusts or the bad monopolies are the ones that, we're more familiar with. They own everything, so they can jack up the prices. They can, abuse the workers because there's such job competition, yada, yada, yada. And then the Elkins and Halpern Act are passed one after another, and both of them just give more authority to the Interstate Commerce Commission that was passed during period 6 during the Gilded Age. That was initially passed as like a permanent body to oversee railroads, because again, railroads is like the biggest industry at this time. But that the ICC was originally not given very much power. There was like no punishment that they could provide if someone was caught forming a monopoly, and so this just gave them more authority to oversee the railroads. And then The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which you guys read in class. So Upton Sinclair is a muckraker, and The Jungle was the expose that he wrote that details the horrible conditions in the meatpacking plant. And so this calls for more consumer protections and more worker protections. So some consumer protections are the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is the prelude to the FDA. And then you have the Meat Inspection Act, which requires federal health inspections. And he was huge into conservation. So there were so many things that he did, but I just picked one, the Forest Reserve Act, which was kind of like the initial one that set aside 150 million acres of land for conservation. Taft came in, and Taft actually doubled the number of trusts that he busted as opposed to Roosevelt, because he didn't make the distinction between good and bad trusts. But besides that, he doesn't do a whole lot when he's in office. He doesn't believe in being super progressive. He's mainly just kind of doing it because that's what is kind of expected at this time, especially coming after another Republican, Roosevelt, and now you have Republican Taft, and he's like, okay. But he passed the Mann-Elkins Act, which again gives more power to the ICC, and the 16th Amendment. That's probably the most notable thing, which starts the income tax, which we all know and love, which is initially, it's going to be passed to fund a lot of these progressive efforts and eventually help fund World War I. Now, the election of 1912, we didn't focus on it too much because I don't want you guys to get stuck too in the weeds on it. But Republicans split into two opposing groups. You have one group that is supportive of Taft, and these are kind of like the OG Republicans, like pro-business, pro-imperialism, all that. And then you have Roosevelt, who is a little bit more of the liberal Republicans, and he's running after a third party that only exists during this time, named after his nickname, the Bull Moose Party. And he is arguing that we should be ultra progressive. And so you can start to see that there's this internal break between the Republican Party. Are they more of should they be a conservative party, or are they more of a liberal party? And this is like where I'm going to point to when we get into later units as like the first sign that the parties are starting to switch to their modern day parts, like the modern day points on the political spectrum, where Democrats are on the left and Republicans are on the right. But because there was a split in the vote, Woodrow Wilson, as a Democrat, secures the win. And when he comes in, he does try to attack what he calls the triple wall of privilege, tariffs, banks, and trusts. The Federal Reserve Board, I don't really care about the Underwood tariff as much, but the Federal Reserve Board creates the Federal Reserve System, which is our whole centralized banking system in the United States, which would make Hamilton so proud, but it controls all the currency. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, which basically just further defined what constitutes a monopoly and allows more people, like allows the government to go after them more. And the Federal Trade Commission, which is still around today as well, like the Federal Reserve Board, which investigates possibly unfair business practices that are not actually, and it's actually enforced. So this can do like just not monopolies, but also like pools, the interlocking directorates, all those kind of things, rebates. Okay, and now we're getting into World War I. And so it all begins with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, where a Serbian nationalist supposedly had murdered the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you guys didn't need to memorize this chain of events, but what I wanted you guys to get out of this was to see what was dragging everyone in. And I highlighted the four, quote, main causes of World War I. So this acronym is M-militarism. That meaning that at this time, people are glorifying the military. That is because in a time where imperialism is running supreme, you need the military to secure that. And also military, like the size of your navy and army, like that's just another way to like measure your country's power. And so like when we're trying to compare the power and like might of different countries, just military is kind of one of those go-to figures. And then alliances. So as you could see, like why people were joining the fight was to go in and defend their buddies. So there's political, economic, social, like in terms of like some people are aligned themselves based on cultural backgrounds, like countries that are similar to them. They can be formal or informal ties. Like the Allied powers was actually originally bonded together in this alliance called the Triple Entente. And so when they become a formalized group, they just become the Allied powers during World War I. And then I is imperialism. So imperialism can actually affect us going to World War I or in other countries going to World War I in multiple ways. First, it created a lot of bad blood between nations, like so pre-existing nations in Europe that they've already been competing over colonies, and so there was already some animosity there. And then, like I just said, that with imperialism, people were building up their military, so there's a sense of preparedness now for a fight. And then you have N, which is nationalism. So the intense belief in superiority in your country, you don't want to back down, you don't want to be seen as inferior. But then also, when we look at the two teams, I mean, a lot of them are bound together by similar types of government, similar types of economies, religion, cultural background. So not only are you fighting, to win, but you're also fighting to maintain superiority of your ideologies, your culture, your background, sometimes your race, for the ethnic backgrounds and heritages for the Central Powers. So the Allied powers are France, Great Britain, and Russia at the start, and Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So you can see they're Central Powers because they're centrally located, but these are just the main power players on both teams. And the U.S. initial response is neutrality, just as it always has been. Like we want to preach isolationism, but we know we get involved. So what happened? So you guys in class looked at the different reasons why it's hard for the US to maintain neutrality and stay isolationist. And so one of the first and biggest ones is going to be submarine warfare. Germany has a brand new naval weapon called the U-boat, the submarine. And it makes it very difficult, no matter how impressive your Navy is, however impressive the Great Britain Navy is, you can't fight a U-boat. There's no way to sink the U-boat when it's underwater, but they can get you. And so that just completely undermines the, the magnificence of the British Navy. And Germany declared, quote, unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that they're not really discriminating against who they're going to hit. And that came to a head when the sinking of the Lusitania happened in 1915. It's a British passenger liner. It did have weapons aboard, but it was considered a neutral ship. Over 100 Americans were on board. And Wilson, again, trying to maintain isolationism and being the moral diplomacy guy, only responds with a strongly worded letter to Germany to not do it again. But almost less than a year later, Germany sunk another unarmed ship. This is the Sussex, which is a ship that had both French and Americans on board. And then Wilson actually went in front of Congress to threaten to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany, which is a little bit more of a threatening response, but still, Americans are a little bit divided on it. And Germany, the only reason why we don't ultimately cut off ties with Germany is because they agreed to the Sussex Pledge, where they promised to not ship another sink without warning them first, so the passengers can clear. But the US, while neutral, is not unbiased. We became very closely tied with the Allied powers for numerous reasons. One, they ordered a lot of supplies from us. And so we are making bank off of their wartime need. And so because of that, we want them to keep winning because they need to keep buying supplies from us. And then also, Great Britain and France are starting to blockade German ports to weaken Germany, but that also simultaneously weakens our trade with Germany because it's hard for us to get over there. But also when Germany's also said that they don't care about who they hit, it makes us also less inclined to dock there as well. We are also a creditor nation, meaning that we've been issuing tons and tons of loans, mainly to France and Great Britain. And if they lose and their economy goes in the crapper, how are they going to pay back the $3 billion? So you can see over time, we have tied ourselves to the success of the Allied powers. And lastly, the Allied powers are taking advantage of American newspapers by literally handing them pre-made propaganda to sell, and it creates a lot of demand, with the newspapers, but they just basically hand over all the propaganda that the American public needs to sway public opinion in favor of the Allied powers. We also have some other internal divisions at home, not just politically, but demographically. Over 30%, that's so much, over 1/3 of our population are first or second generation immigrants coming from the countries that we are declaring war against, specifically too. And so like we divided sympathies. And then internally, just politically, this should we go to war debate is growing larger and larger, and Republicans are arguing for preparedness. That could be partially because, maybe if we win, we can get more land. War is good for businesses at home. So they can be a little biased there. But Democrats, populists, progressives, socialists, all these other people are opposed to the war because they would rather focus on what's going on at home, all of our domestic issues that we barely started to solve. They want to continue the progressive era. But in 1916, Wilson is reelected under the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which could be an indication to us that the majority of the American public wanted to be isolationist. But less than a week after he was sworn into office, we declare war on Germany. So what the heck happened? Three things happen. One, the continued use of submarine warfare by the Germans, our neutrality and our trade are just being hurt too much. The second being the Russian Revolution, and this has kind of a two-parter. So Russia's going to have actually two revolutions back to back. This initial one, though, is enough to pull them out of the war, where they're going to establish a republic, and shortly after, it's going to be taken over then by a communist party in like its second revolution, but we're not going to get into that so much right now. All you need to know is that it took Russia out of the war. And so this is bad for two reasons. It matters for two reasons. One is because with Russia out of the Allied power group, we feel more comfortable joining that side because we identify greatly with France and Great Britain. We did not identify with Russia that had an autocratic czar and did not have democracy, did not have capitalism. And so culturally, we did not want to align ourselves with a country that stands for things that we do not. And then simultaneously, when Russia pulls out, as we'll see in a map in a second, Germany no longer has to worry about the Eastern Front, and it can now focus all of their resources on the Western Front, which is where the main area of fighting is. And so now the Allied powers are kind of at their most vulnerable. And the third and final step is the Zimmermann telegram. Great Britain just so happened to intercept a telegram from Germany to Mexico, proposing that if Mexico had attacked the United States, that Germany would restore some land that the US had lost in the Mexican-American War, particularly California, they had their eye on. And this is leaked into the American newspapers. And, again, in the court of public opinion, America is outraged, call for war. So now that we've declared war, what are some of the issues that we need to overcome in order to be successful? Well, we need to mobilize our economy and fundraise for the war. And so what's noteworthy is that if this happened during the Gilded Age, the efficiency to transforming ourselves into a command economy to meet the wartime demand would probably not have been as successful. It is because we're coming off of the heels of the progressive era, where the government got more involved in regulatory than ever before. It was not so much of a jump for the government, the federal government, to take so much control and command over our economy, even if it was temporary. It's just very anti-American compared to our past. And so the progressive era, the context of the progressive era is key to know, to understand why this happened. So the War Industry Board is no longer actually in your book, but they're the group that helped oversee everything to create a command economy. And then you have the National War Labor Board, which we cannot risk a strike. We can't risk a strike or a slowdown. And so to keep workers happy, they got benefits that they would never previously got, better working conditions, higher wages, all to keep fueling the war effort. And then you also had other groups like the Food Administration and the Fuel Administration arguing rationing and conserving, so you're not wasting materials for the war effort. So the Food Administration would encourage, to grow victory gardens, meatless Wednesdays, meatless Mondays, all those things. How we financed the war, we got $33 billion in loans from other countries, mainly though from income taxes from the 16th Amendment and Liberty bonds, which is money that citizens pay to the government. So the government gets an influx of cash, but they're supposed to pay you back at a later time. But then women and African Americans see a lot of new job opportunities during the war that will help the civil rights discussions post-World War I. And then there's the issue of public support and morale. You have to have continued public support throughout the war if you want people to, buy Liberty bonds, to conserve their resources, to enlist, to do all these things. And so the Committee of Public Information was created purely to churn out the propaganda needed to equate what everyone wants them to do, to buy Liberty bonds with patriotism, with being American. However, not everyone was on board with that. The Espionage and Sedition Acts are things that are probably, sticking out to you, is already sounding familiar. We see these passed time and time again. This is like the third or fourth time we've already talked about it in this course alone. And again, it's usually during a time of war where the federal government believes in the name of public safety, it is okay to suspend your Bill of Rights. And that's exactly what they did. But when it went up to the Supreme Court, as this prohibited, or this going against the First Amendment, Schneck versus the United States upheld the Espionage and Sedition Act, saying that because there's a clear and present danger, allowing that kind of loophole, that this was allowed to happen, just like it did during the Civil War, just like it did when France and Great Britain were fighting, and we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts back in period 3. And then we had the Selective Service Act, which drafted almost 3 million American men into the into like a lottery system, but ultimately 3 million men were actually enlisted from that lottery system, and almost 400,000 African American men served in segregated units alongside of them, again helping that civil rights discussion post-war. So what does the actual fighting of the war look like when we arrive? Because by the time that our first US troops hit the ground, it's late in 1917. Millions of Europeans have already died. Both other nations have been fighting for 3 years now. They are both depleted. And most of this fighting is concentrated on the Western Front. So what is that? So the first aggressive action of the war was when Germany invaded Belgium. They plowed through Belgium over here, which was a neutral nation at the time, to catch France by surprise and not just go through France where it bordered Germany. And once they were halted by French forces right here, that became known as the Western Front, meaning like a front as an area of fighting. And it became a front because it just stalemated. There was no really gains or losses. And for 3 years, both sides just hunkered down in miles and miles of trenches and developed trench warfare as a way to combat all of the new weaponry that we're seeing in World War One that we have not seen previously due to industrialization. We're seeing all this horrific weaponry, things that were not created even for the original use, like barbed wire that was used to close the western frontier and like for cattle ranges, and now it's being used to surround trenches so no one can, to rush the trench. You see blimps, machine guns, chemical warfare, all of these things that people are now having to mentally and physically deal with. And then, like I said, the Bolshevik Revolution is actually the second revolution that Russia has to face. And while Russia is still out of the war, that's something that we're going to revisit in 7B, like why we care about now that revolution. The initial revolution failed, and then a communist one took over. But then America, when we enter, our two contributions are our men and our Navy. The convoy system, they just need numbers of boats to do that. And because we have this new impressive Navy, we have the numbers to do this. So the convoy system is actually a British idea to combat Germany's U-boat, where we could just use many decoy ships essentially to surround ships that actually had the resources and the soldiers aboard that we want to transport. And now the U-boat just doesn't know which one to go after. And so hopefully with these decoys, it protects or at least gets some of the places that we want to reach, actually accessible. And then the other thing we can contribute is all of the men that see action. Most of them go to the Western Front and the American Expeditionary Force, which liberates France and pushes Germany all the way back to their home country, ultimately forcing Germany to sign an armistice on November 11th, 1918. So now that the war is essentially over, how do we settle terms for peace and make sure this does not happen again? And so you looked at Wilson's 14 points. This is his plan that he created right before the war ended, and it listed his aims for addressing the causes of World War I and preventing another one from happening. And the two terms you need to know from all this is self-determination and League of Nations. Self-determination means like the country's abilities to decide their own fate, because his 14 points is dripping with the word independence. You see it several times. He proposes a lot of independence and freedom, but then he also proposes the League of Nations, which is a general association of nations meant to keep peace. So an international peacekeeping organization where every country would be involved and have a say. But the Treaty of Versailles is what we actually get. So the leaders of all the Allied powers, minus Russia because they're still out of the war, but France, Great Britain, the US, and Italy, since they switched sides, are all present. So it's the victors deciding the fate of the losers. And again, it's worth noting that Wilson is coming in with a very idealistic viewpoint because the US has not been touched nearly as much as the other European nations, not hurt as much, while the other three have. And so they're out for blood when they come to meet. But Wilson is promoting peace without victory, meaning that if you have a victor, you have a loser. If you have a loser, you're going to have bad feelings. If there's bad feelings, a war can happen again. And so he wants no punishment, no hard feelings. He just wants to move past. But the Treaty of Versailles is not about that. It's all about punishing Germany. It does create some new independent nations, but we'll talk about why that's different in a second than Wilson's 14-point plan. But Germany is significantly disarmed, stripped of its colonies, its navy, its army has been whittled down to nothing. They have to accept guilt for all of the wars, called the War Guilt Clause, pay reparations, like 30 billion in that time's currency, to Great Britain and France for damages. They're going to be occupied by French military for 15 years to oversee the demilitarization. And then from those nations that lost, Germany, Austria-Hungary, new nations are being created. So that is the key difference between Wilson's 14 points that grants independence to places like Serbia, like places that were already created. I mean, he does suggest Poland and stuff, but what's mainly different with the Treaty of Versailles is that these new nations are only new because we literally broke apart the loser nations into several small nations to weaken them. And that is something that we're going to revisit in 7B. But the one thing they do keep from Wilson's 14 points is the League of Nations, Article 10. But it is not over there. Wilson still has to get this approved by Congress because they're the ones who approve treaties, and they're very split. The irreconcilables in Congress completely reject the Treaty of Versailles purely on the basis of the League of Nations. We do not want to break our isolationist history and essentially join an alliance with every single other nation in the entire world. That is a complete 180, the complete opposite of what we've done. And so ultimately, the US does not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, so we do not join the League of Nations. So ironically, the one nation that proposed the League of Nations is the one nation that is voluntarily opting to not be a part of the League of Nations. And that is where we left off. All of the post-war stuff, all these post-war problems in your book, you can start getting familiar with them right now, but we are going to revisit this all at the start of 7B because I think it's all happening within post-war 1920s all at the same time. And so it just makes more sense to discuss those there. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I hope this video was helpful.